The fluorescent lights of room 109 hummed, casting a sterile glow over the rows of desks. Mr. Halper droned on about Shakespearean sonnets, his voice a monotonous wave that washed over the class, lulling most into a state of semi-consciousness. Imani Rivers, however, remained alert, not because of any particular interest in iambic pentameter, but because of the persistent, unsettling gaze of Jordan Mercer. He sat 2 rows behind and to her left, his restlessness radiating like heat from a faulty radiator. Imani could feel his eyes on her, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. Why does he keep staring? She wondered, a ripple of unease disturbing the calm surface of her thoughts. She tried to focus on the teacher's words, the rhythmic rise and fall of his voice a fragile shield against Jordan's scrutiny. Just ignore him, she told herself, the silent mantra a familiar defense against unwanted attention. Jordan, however, wasn't one for subtle observation. He thrived on disruption, his social currency measured in gasps and giggles. He nudged his friend, Kevin, whispering something that made Kevin snicker, their shared laughter a sharp discord in the otherwise droning classroom. Imani felt her stomach clench. The laughter, she knew, wasn't directed at anything Mr. Halper had said. It was about her. She could feel it, a deep, visceral certainty that settled like a stone in her gut. What were they planning? The question echoed in her mind, each repetition amplifying her unease. She ran a hand through her long, dark hair, a nervous habit she'd been trying to break. The smooth, silky texture momentarily soothed her, a tactile reminder of control in a situation that felt increasingly beyond her grasp. Jordan shifted in his seat, the metallic glint of something catching the light. Scissors. Imani's breath hitched in her throat. Where did he even get those? She knew the art room was down the hall, but bringing scissors to English class seemed deliberate. A cold dread began to creep up her spine, replacing the initial unease with a sharp, chilling premonition. She tried to catch Mr. Halper's eye, a silent plea for intervention, but the teacher, lost in his own world of rhyming couplets, remained oblivious. The next few seconds unfolded in slow motion. Jordan leaned forward, his hand reaching out, the scissors glinting ominously in the artificial light. Imani froze, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting impulses. Should she duck? Should she shout? But before she could react, the cold steel grazed her scalp, a strange, detached sensation followed by the soft whisper of falling hair. A collective gasp rippled through the classroom, the sudden intake of breath shattering the monotonous rhythm of Mr. Halper's lecture. He stopped mid-sentence, his brow furrowed in confusion. Several students turned to stare, their expressions a mixture of shock and nervous amusement. Kevin let out a loud guffaw, the sound grating on Imani's nerves. Jordan held up the severed lock of hair, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "It's just hair," he said, his voice dripping with dismissive nonchalance. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken malice. Imani sat perfectly still, her mind a silent storm. Anger, humiliation, and a profound sense of violation warred within her. Yet, outwardly, she remained composed. She slowly bent down and picked up the severed lock of hair, her fingers closing around it with surprising firmness. The smooth, silken strands felt strangely alien, a tangible reminder of the casual cruelty she had just endured. She held it up, her gaze meeting Jordan's, her silence more potent than any outburst of rage. The laughter died down, replaced by an uncomfortable hush. Jordan's smirk faltered, his bravado cracking under the weight of her unwavering gaze. He had expected tears, a predictable display of feminine fragility. He had expected outrage, a satisfying confirmation of his power. He had not expected this chilling calm, this quiet defiance that stripped him bare, exposing the insecurity beneath his veneer of bravado. Mr. Halper, finally realizing something was amiss, stammered, "What happened here?" His voice was laced with bewilderment, a testament to his utter detachment from the dynamics of his own classroom. Imani continued to hold Jordan's gaze, her silence a powerful indictment. not just of his actions, but of the silent complicity of everyone who had witnessed the incident and done nothing. The severed lock of hair in her hand felt heavy, a symbol of something far more significant than a childish prank. It was a testament to the insidious nature of disrespect, the casual cruelty that thrived in the shadows of indifference. And in that moment, Imani knew that this was not just about her hair. It was about something much, much bigger. The silence hung heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from shock and stifled breaths. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams that slanted through the classroom windows, illuminating the stark reality of the severed lock of hair lying on the linoleum floor. Jordan Mercer shifted, the metal legs of his chair scraping against the floor, a sound that grated on Imani's nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. He tried for a nonchalant shrug, a smirk playing on his lips. "Just a joke, Rivers," he muttered, his voice a little too loud in the unnerving quiet. He tucked a stray strand of his own gelled hair behind his ear, the gesture almost practiced, a casual defiance that sent a shiver of cold anger down Imani's spine. "Just a joke." The words echoed in her mind, hollow and meaningless. Imani's fingers curled into fists, the sharp edges of her trimmed nails digging into her palms. She could feel the pulsing throb where the hair had been severed, a phantom ache that mirrored the deeper wound to her dignity. Jordan's smirk was a physical manifestation of his disregard, a blatant declaration of his belief that he was above consequence. He hadn't even bothered to look at her directly, his gaze flitting around the room, gauging the reaction of his audience, seeking approval, seeking validation for his transgression. Imani's breath hitched. This wasn't about humor. It was about power, about asserting dominance in the most juvenile, yet devastatingly effective, way. The classroom remained frozen. Mr. Halper, oblivious at the front of the room, continued his droning lecture on the symbolism of mockingbirds in Harper Lee's novel, his words fading into the white noise of Imani's racing thoughts. How could he not have seen? How could an entire room full of people witness such a blatant act of disrespect and remain silent? The air thickened with the weight of their collective inaction, each averted gaze a testament to the insidious nature of apathy. Imani felt a wave of nausea wash over her, the suffocating realization that she was alone in this, surrounded by witnesses who chose to be blind. Slowly, deliberately, Imani bent down and picked up the severed lock of hair. It felt strangely weightless in her hand, a tangible representation of the violation she had just endured. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held it up, the dark strands catching the light, a stark contrast against the pale skin of her palm. The classroom held its breath. Even Jordan's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. He didn't understand. He hadn't anticipated this reaction. He'd expected tears, perhaps a shout, something he could easily dismiss, something that would fit neatly into his narrative of a harmless prank. Imani walked towards Jordan's desk, each step measured, each footfall echoing in the oppressive silence. The scent of his cologne, something sharp and synthetic, filled her nostrils, a further intrusion into her personal space. She stopped directly in front of him, her shadow falling across his desk, a silent eclipse. He looked up at her then, his eyes finally meeting hers. There was a flicker of something in their depths, not quite fear, but a dawning realization that he had miscalculated. He had underestimated her. With a steady hand, Imani placed the severed lock of hair on his desk, directly in front of him. The soft strands lay there, a stark reminder of his transgression. The gesture was simple, yet profound. It was a reclamation of power, a refusal to be silenced. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and steady, each word carrying the weight of her controlled fury. "You touched something sacred," she said, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't ask." The words hung in the air, vibrating with unspoken meaning. They were not just about the hair. They were about boundaries, about respect, about the inherent right to bodily autonomy. They were about the unspoken rules of social hierarchy that allowed someone like Jordan to believe he could act with impunity. They were about the silent complicity of those who witnessed the act and chose to look away. Jordan's face flushed, a mixture of anger and embarrassment warring for dominance. He opened his mouth to speak, to retort with some sarcastic remark, some dismissive justification. But the words caught in his throat. He couldn't find the right combination of syllables to dismantle the quiet power of her statement. For the first time, he seemed genuinely unsure of himself, the bravado that usually shielded him cracking under the intensity of her gaze. He looked down at the lock of hair on his desk, as if seeing it for the first time. The smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of something akin to understanding. Or perhaps just the beginning of it. The classroom remained silent, the weight of Imani's words pressing down on them all. Mr. Halper finally paused in his lecture, his eyes scanning the room, a flicker of confusion clouding his features. He had sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the palpable tension that had settled over the room. He looked from Imani to Jordan, his gaze questioning. But he didn't speak. Not yet. The silence stretched, a fragile thread connecting them all. In that silence, a shift occurred. The balance of power, so subtly skewed, began to recalibrate. The unspoken rules were being rewritten, and Imani, standing there, small but unwavering, held the pen. The bell's shrill cry sliced through the tense silence that had settled over the classroom, a stark contrast to the casual snip of scissors that had preceded it. Imani Rivers remained motionless, her gaze fixed on the fallen strands of her hair scattered across the worn wooden desk. A single, dark lock curled against the open page of her textbook, a stark visual reminder of Jordan Mercer's impulsive act. The classroom erupted in the usual cacophony of scraping chairs and chattering voices, a wave of normalcy washing over the extraordinary. But for Imani, the world had shifted. It wasn't the loss of a few inches of hair that resonated. It was the casual disregard, the silent complicity of the witnesses, the unsettling realization that such violations could be so easily dismissed. She rose, the movement deliberate and measured, a quiet storm gathering within her. Around her, the tide of students flowed towards the door, oblivious, uncaring, or perhaps simply too afraid to acknowledge the undercurrent of injustice. Mr. Halper, lost in the clutter of his desk, seemed to have missed the entire incident, his attention already absorbed by the next lesson plan. The casual indifference stung more than the initial act itself. It was a stark demonstration of how easily cruelty could be normalized, how silence became a form of consent. Imani's stomach twisted, a knot of nausea tightening with each careless laugh, each averted gaze. As she walked down the crowded hallway, the echo of Jordan's snicker reverberated in her ears. He had wanted a reaction: tears, anger, a public display of distress, something to validate his pathetic attempt at dominance. He wouldn't get it. Imani's mother, Tasha, a woman whose strength was etched not in loud proclamations, but in quiet resilience, had taught her the power of composure, the strength found in stillness. "Don't let them see you break," she'd often say. "Let your silence be their judgment." The fluorescent lights of the hallway buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the swirling mass of students. Imani navigated the throng, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Humiliation warred with a strange sense of calm, anger with a cold determination. She needed space, a moment of solitude to process the tangled threads of her thoughts. The girls' bathroom, a haven of relative quiet in the chaotic school environment, beckoned. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cheap perfume and hairspray. Imani leaned against the cool porcelain of the sink, staring at her reflection. The uneven edge of her hair, a jagged testament to Jordan's impulsive cruelty, was starkly visible. She reached out, her fingers tracing the uneven line, the sensation both foreign and unsettling. Beneath the surface of her controlled demeanor, a storm raged. She felt a flicker of fear, a primal urge to run, to hide, to erase the incident from her memory. But something held her back, a nascent strength that whispered of defiance, of justice, of reclaiming her own narrative. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a familiar vibration that momentarily broke her trance. It was a text from her mother, a simple "How was school?" The question, so ordinary in its context, felt laden with unspoken concern. Imani stared at the message, a wave of warmth washing over the cold knot in her stomach. Her mother wouldn't dismiss it as a prank. She wouldn't tell her to just ignore it. Tasha Rivers understood the subtle nuances of injustice, the insidious nature of casual cruelty. Imani's fingers hovered over the keyboard, a flurry of possible responses flashing through her mind. Should she tell her mother what happened? Should she downplay it, pretend it didn't matter? The urge to confide in her, to seek comfort in her mother's strength, was overwhelming. Yet, a different impulse, a quiet voice whispering of self-reliance, held her back. This was her battle to fight. This was her moment to embody the lessons her mother had so patiently instilled in her. She took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs, a steadying force against the turmoil within. Her fingers began to move, tapping out a carefully crafted response. Going to the gym after school. It was a simple lie, a subtle deflection, but it held a deeper meaning, a coded message of intent. The gym wasn't just a place for physical exertion. It was where Imani went to clear her head, to gather her strength, to prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. It was her sanctuary, her battleground. The reply from her mother came swiftly. "Okay, sweetie. See you later." The brevity of the message belied the depth of understanding that flowed between them. Tasha knew. Somehow she knew. And in that unspoken knowledge, Imani found a renewed sense of purpose. The fear that had flickered within her began to recede, replaced by a steely resolve. This wasn't just about a few strands of hair. It was about respect, about dignity, about refusing to be silenced. It was about drawing a line in the sand and saying, "Enough." Imani tucked her phone back into her pocket, the small device a tangible link to her mother's strength. She looked at her reflection once more, her gaze meeting her own eyes. The uncertainty that had clouded her expression moments before had vanished, replaced by a quiet confidence, a flicker of something hard and unyielding. The uneven edge of her hair no longer seemed a symbol of vulnerability, but a badge of defiance, a testament to the battles yet to come. She straightened her shoulders, a subtle shift in posture that spoke volumes. The storm within had subsided, leaving behind a chilling calm, the stillness before the strike. Jordan Mercer, and everyone who had stood by in silent complicity, would learn the meaning of that stillness. They would learn the power of a quiet storm. The metallic tang of sweat hung heavy in the air, a familiar perfume Imani had breathed in since she was a child. The rhythmic thud of gloves against leather echoed around the Rivers boxing gym, each impact a small earthquake in the otherwise still afternoon. Sunlight, fractured by the grimy windows high above, painted stripes across the worn canvas of the ring. Imani sat on the edge of the ring, the coarse ropes digging into the backs of her thighs. She didn't register the discomfort. Her gaze, fixed on the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, held a strange stillness, like a pool of dark water concealing untold depths. Her fingers, calloused from years of gripping jump ropes and punching bags, traced the uneven edge of the severed lock of hair clutched in her palm. It was a rich, dark brown, almost black, catching the light with a subtle reddish sheen the same color as her mother's. Each strand felt like a tiny betrayal, a violation. She closed her fist around it, the sharp ends pricking her skin, a physical echo of the invisible wound Jordan Mercer had carved into her. He doesn't even know what he's done, she thought, the words forming silently in her mind, not quite reaching the surface of conscious speech. He thinks it's a joke, a laugh. But the laughter she'd heard in the classroom hadn't been the light, carefree sound of amusement. It had been something else, something darker, a sound that fed on the humiliation of another. The gym door creaked open, admitting a gust of cooler air and the familiar silhouette of her mother. Tasha Rivers moved with an economical grace, her steps sure and silent on the concrete floor. Her eyes, the same deep brown as Imani's, scanned the room, landing on her daughter with a quiet understanding that bypassed the need for words. Tasha didn't rush. She never did. She crossed the gym, the only sound the soft rustle of her workout clothes, and sat beside Imani, her presence a solid anchor in the swirling chaos of the girl's thoughts. Imani unfurled her fingers, revealing the severed lock. Her mother took it, her touch gentle, almost reverent. She turned it over in her hand, the sunlight catching the sheen of the hair, illuminating the clean, brutal cut. A muscle twitched in her jaw, the only outward sign of her anger. Imani watched her, a strange sense of detachment washing over her. It was as if she were observing the scene from a distance, a spectator in her own life. "He cut your hair," Tasha stated, her voice low and steady, devoid of the shrill outrage Imani might have expected from another mother. It was a statement of fact, not a question. In class, Imani added, her voice barely a whisper. The humiliation, banked down for so long, threatened to break through her carefully constructed composure. Why didn't I scream? Why didn't I fight back? The questions gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. And Mr. Halper? Tasha's question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Imani swallowed, the lump in her throat thick and constricting. He didn't see. The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Tasha's silence stretched, filled only by the distant rhythm of skipping rope and the muffled grunts of a sparring match. She was giving Imani the space to speak, to unravel the tangled threads of the afternoon's events. Imani knew this. She appreciated it, but the words wouldn't come. They were trapped, caught somewhere between the burning shame and the cold, hard knot of anger that was tightening in her chest. Finally, Tasha spoke, her voice soft but firm. Sometimes silence is a warning, Imani. She looked at her daughter, her gaze unwavering. A storm gathers its strength in stillness. Imani met her mother's gaze, the words resonating deep within her. A warning. Yes, that's what she wanted it to be. Not a plea, not a cry for help. A warning. It wasn't just hair, Imani said, the words catching in her throat, roughened by the sudden surge of emotion. It was mine. He took something without asking. Her fingers curled into fists, the nails digging into her palms. The injustice of it burned within her, a slow, simmering rage. Tasha nodded, a flicker of something hard and unyielding in her eyes. He did. She didn't offer empty platitudes or promises of swift retribution. She understood that this went deeper than a childish prank. It was about respect, about boundaries, about the insidious ways in which small acts of aggression could erode a person's sense of self. "What are you going to do?" Tasha asked, her voice gentle but probing. The fluorescent lights of Oaked High hummed, a dull counterpoint to the electric tension that now crackled through the hallways. The air, usually thick with the scent of stale cafeteria food and teenage apathy, now carried a different charge, a mix of apprehension and hushed whispers. The video, grainy and shot from a shaky hand across the classroom, had spread like wildfire through social media. It showed everything: Jordan's bravado as he leaned over Imani, the sickening snip of the scissors, the fall of her severed braid, and most importantly, Imani's reaction, or rather, her lack of one. Her face, a mask of unsettling calm, held no tears, no screams, no outward display of the expected distress. Just a flicker of something cold and deep in her eyes. The caption accompanying the video, stark against the pixelated footage, read simply, "He messed with the wrong one." Jordan, usually the center of his boisterous group, now moved through the halls like a ghost. The laughter that usually trailed him was gone, replaced by sideways glances and hushed conversations that died as he passed. He could feel the weight of every stare, each whisper a tiny pinprick deflating the arrogant bubble he had so carefully constructed around himself. "They think I'm a monster," he thought, the realization sinking in with a chilling weight. Maybe I am. He hadn't anticipated this. He'd imagined Imani crying, the teacher scolding him, maybe a detention, a minor inconvenience, a price to pay for a good laugh. But this silent condemnation, This ripple effect of fear and judgment was something else entirely. He'd miscalculated. Badly. Imani, however, moved through the same hallways with an almost unnerving tranquility. The whispers followed her too, but these were different. They held a mixture of awe, respect, and a touch of fear. She felt the shift in the air, the way the usual social hierarchy seemed to tremble in the wake of this incident. The power dynamics had changed, and she, the quiet girl, was now at the epicenter. They think I'm strong, she thought, her fingers tracing the blunt edge of her now shortened hair. But strength isn't the absence of fear. It's facing it head-on. The school's response was slow, almost glacial. Mr. Halper, still reeling from the realization of his own obliviousness, had offered a stammering apology. He hadn't even noticed, caught as he was in the labyrinth of his lesson plan. Now he avoided Imani's gaze, guilt churning in his stomach. I should have seen it. He berated himself silently. I should have done something. Miss Vega, the assistant principal, had called Imani into her office, a bland room smelling faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. The initial conversation had focused on procedure, on filling out forms, on following protocol. The underlying message was clear: keep it quiet, keep it contained. Imani, however, didn't flinch. She met Miss Vega's gaze, her own eyes reflecting a quiet strength that belied her 15 years. It's not about the hair, Miss Vega, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. It's about respect. It's about accountability. Miss Vega, a woman accustomed to teenage dramatics and easily diffused tantrums, found herself unsettled by Imani's composure. This wasn't a crying, distraught girl seeking comfort. This was a young woman demanding justice. A subtle shift occurred in Miss Vega's demeanor, a flicker of recognition. This girl is different, she thought, a newfound respect creeping into her assessment. She's not going to let this go. As the days wore on, a groundswell of support began to build around Imani. Students who had never spoken to her before offered words of encouragement, small gestures of solidarity. The video, initially a source of humiliation, had become a symbol of defiance, a testament to the power of silent resistance. At home, Imani's mother, Tasha, watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. She saw the weight Imani carried, the emotional toll of the public scrutiny. "You don't have to carry this alone, Imani," she said, her voice laced with the quiet strength that had shaped her daughter. "There are people who care, people who want to help." Imani met her mother's gaze, a silent, understanding passing between them. She knew she wasn't alone, and she knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about changing the narrative, about challenging a culture that allowed such acts to happen, about creating a space where respect wasn't just expected, but demanded. The silence, once a weapon used against her, had now become her shield, a powerful force that was slowly, inexorably shifting the balance of power within the walls of Oak High. The ripple effect of a single snip of scissors had begun to unravel the carefully constructed social fabric, exposing the raw nerves of injustice and the quiet strength of those who dared to resist. The fluorescent lights of Miss Vega's office hummed, a sterile, buzzing counterpoint to the turmoil churning inside Imani. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and something vaguely floral, perhaps a desperate attempt to mask the underlying scent of stale paperwork and institutional indifference. She sat rigidly, the plastic chair cold against her bare legs. Across from her, Miss Vega shuffled papers, her expression a carefully neutral mask that Imani recognized as practiced indifference. 2 days. 2 days since a chunk of her hair had fallen to the classroom floor. 2 days since the laughter had echoed in her ears. And 2 days since the school's response had been lacking. A tepid email to her mother, a vague promise of looking into the matter. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. Had this happened to someone else, someone higher up the social ladder, someone whose father donated generously to the school's athletic program, would the response have been the same? The question hung heavy in the air, unspoken but palpable. Miss Vega cleared her throat, the sound crisp and professional. "Imani, we understand this has been unpleasant. We're taking the appropriate steps. Appropriate steps. The phrase felt hollow, a bureaucratic shield against genuine action. Imani watched the way Miss Vega avoided her gaze, the subtle tightening of her lips. This wasn't about justice. This was about damage control. About protecting the school's reputation, not its students. The realization settled in her stomach, a cold, hard knot of disappointment. Appropriate steps? Imani echoed, her voice surprisingly steady, a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed until this moment. 2 days ago, in the middle of class, Jordan Mercer cut my hair. Without provocation, without consequence. Each word was deliberate, a precise strike against the wall of indifference. We understand that, Imani, Miss Vega replied, her tone laced with a placating sweetness that grated on Imani's nerves. And we are addressing it. Mr. Halper has spoken with Jordan. Spoken with him. Not reprimanded. Not disciplined. Spoken with him. The absurdity of it made a bitter laugh rise in Imani's throat, but she swallowed it down. Anger wouldn't serve her here. Calm, controlled articulation of the injustice that was her weapon. Spoken with him? Imani repeated, tilting her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. And what, pray tell, did Mr. Halper say? Did he express his deep disappointment at Jordan's blatant disregard for school rules and basic human decency? Or perhaps he commended him on his creative hairstyling techniques? The irony dripped from her words, each syllable sharpened with the honed edge of her suppressed fury. Miss Vega shifted uncomfortably, the carefully constructed mask of neutrality beginning to crack. Imani, we're following procedure. Procedure. That word again. A shield, a justification, an excuse for inaction. Imani's fingers tightened around the edges of the plastic chair. She thought of her mother, of the quiet strength she exuded, the unwavering belief in standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. She drew a deep breath, channeling that strength, letting it fill the hollow spaces within her. Procedure? Imani asked, her voice soft, almost a whisper, but the intensity in her eyes belied the gentle tone. What about the procedure that protects students from harassment? What about the procedure that ensures a safe learning environment? Or does that procedure only apply to certain students? The silence that followed stretched, heavy and thick with unspoken accusations. Miss Vega's gaze finally met Imani's, a flicker of something akin to understanding or perhaps just annoyance flashing in her eyes. Imani, Miss Vega began, but Imani cut her off, her voice rising, no longer a whisper, but a clear, steady demand. I want an apology. A real apology, not some scripted, insincere platitude. And I want the same protection you'd give any other girl in this school. Is that too much to ask? The words hung in the air, vibrating with the force of her conviction. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. Charged. Expectant. Imani held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The fluorescent lights continued to hum. The sterile scent of disinfectant still permeated the air, but something had shifted. The balance of power, perhaps. The realization that silence could be a weapon, that quiet defiance could shatter the walls of indifference. She waited, the silence stretching, each tick of the unseen clock amplifying the weight of her unspoken demand. An apology. Accountability. Respect. It was time someone listened. The fluorescent lights of Oaked High hummed a monotonous tune, their cold glare reflecting off the polished floors. Imani walked through the hallways, the silence almost palpable. It wasn't the usual hushed quiet before the morning bell, the kind pregnant with anticipation and whispered gossip. This silence was different, heavy, charged, a silent current thrumming beneath the surface of the mundane. She ran a hand along the uneven edge of her hair, the blunt cut a constant reminder of the violation. The fluorescent lights of the English classroom hummed, a monotonous soundtrack to the tense silence that had settled over the room. Dust motes danced in the pale beams, illuminating the strained faces of the students. Imani Rivers sat ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the chipped formica of her desk. The The severed strands of her hair lay scattered there, a stark reminder of the violation she had endured. He thought he could break me, she thought, her fingers tracing the rough edge of the cut. He thought a laugh, a few snickers from his friends, would be enough to diminish me. But Jordan Mercer had underestimated her. He'd underestimated the quiet strength that simmered beneath her composed exterior. He'd underestimated the fire that now burned in the pit of her stomach, a slow, controlled burn that fueled her resolve. Mr. Halper, seemingly oblivious to the charged atmosphere, droned on about Shakespearean sonnets, his voice a distant, irrelevant murmur. Imani's gaze swept over her classmates. Some avoided her eyes, shamefaced. Others, Jordan's usual entourage, wore expressions of nervous bravado. Their forced nonchalance was a thin veil over their unease. They had expected tears, a dramatic outburst, something they could easily dismiss. But Imani's quiet dignity, her unwavering composure, had disarmed them. It had exposed the hollowness of their laughter, the cruelty of their indifference. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, Imani raised her hand. Mr. Halper, mid-sentence, paused and blinked at her owlishly. "Yes, Miss Rivers?" His voice was tinged with mild surprise, as if her participation in class were an unexpected event. "I'd like to say something," Imani stated, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the stagnant air. "This isn't just about me," she thought, her heart pounding against her ribs. "This is about every girl who has ever been made to feel small, every girl who has been told to laugh it off." The classroom fell utterly silent. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade into the background. "This isn't just about hair," Imani began, her voice resonating with a quiet power that commanded attention. "Hair grows back, but respect, once lost, is much harder to regain." She paused, letting her words hang in the air, allowing them to seep into the consciousness of her classmates. She saw a flicker of understanding in the eyes of Sarah Jenkins, a girl who often sat alone, a girl who also knew what it felt like to be overlooked, to be the target of casual cruelty. "What Jordan did," Imani continued, her gaze shifting to meet Jordan's, "wasn't a prank. It was a violation. He didn't just touch hair, he touched me. And in doing so, he touched every girl in this room, every girl who's ever had their personal space invaded, their boundaries disregarded, their feelings ignored." Jordan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her gaze. The nervous laughter of his friends had died, replaced by a stunned silence. Imani's voice, though soft, carried a weight that filled the room. "We are taught to be polite, to be quiet, to not make a fuss. But sometimes silence is complicity. Sometimes silence is what allows this kind of behavior to continue." She looked at Mr. Halper, her gaze steady and unwavering. "We are supposed to be safe here. We are supposed to be able to learn without fear of being humiliated, without fear of being violated." A wave of nausea rolled over Jordan. The attention, once exhilarating, now felt like a suffocating weight. He had anticipated a quick laugh, a fleeting moment of dominance. He hadn't anticipated this quiet storm of controlled fury. He'd misread Imani completely. Imani continued, her voice rising slightly, fueled by the righteous anger that burned within her. "And to those of you who watched, who laughed, who did nothing," her gaze swept over the faces of Jordan's friends, lingering on each one, "your silence speaks volumes. You are as much a part of this as he is." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Several students shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "I'm not asking for sympathy," Imani stated, her voice ringing with conviction. "I'm asking for respect. I am asking for accountability. I'm asking for all of us to be better, to do better, to stand up for what is right, even when it's difficult, even when it's uncomfortable." The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer the silence of indifference, but the silence of contemplation, the silence of recognition, the silence of change. Imani stood, the severed strands of her hair falling to the floor like fallen leaves. She met Jordan's gaze one last time, her eyes blazing with a quiet fire. "You may have cut my hair," she said, her voice low and steady, "but you will not silence me." And with that, she turned and walked out of the classroom, leaving behind a room full of students grappling with the weight of her words, the power of her silent resistance, and the undeniable truth of her accusation. The air, thick with unspoken words and shifting dynamics, crackled with the promise of change. The metallic tang of sweat hung heavy in the air, a familiar scent that clung to the worn leather of the punching bags and the cracked vinyl of the gym floor. River's boxing gym wasn't a place for the faint of heart. It was a crucible, a place where weakness was forged into strength. Imani watched her mother, Tasha, move with the grace of a panther, her fists a blur as they connected with the heavy bag. Each thud resonated not just through the gym, but through Imani herself, a steady rhythm that echoed the quiet strength she was discovering within. The rhythmic thumping became a counterpoint to the turmoil that had been churning within her since the incident. "He thought he could diminish me," she mused, the thought a cold ember glowing in the quiet spaces of her mind. "He thought a pair of scissors could cut away my spirit. But he was wrong, so profoundly wrong. He had underestimated the quiet strength that ran in her blood, a legacy inherited from generations of women who had faced far greater trials with unwavering resolve. He hadn't broken her. He'd awakened something within her. The bell above the gym door chimed, announcing their departure. Tasha, her face flushed with exertion, met Imani's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. They didn't need words. The shared experience of the gym, the sweat, the exertion, it was a language all their own. "Ready for the next step?" Tasha asked, a hint of steel in her voice. It wasn't a question about a haircut. It was about taking back control, about reclaiming what had been violated. The salon was a stark contrast to the raw energy of the gym. Soft music drifted through the air, a gentle counterpoint to the rhythmic snip of the scissors. The stylist, a woman with kind eyes and a reassuring smile, understood without explanation. She knew what this haircut meant. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about transformation, about shedding the remnants of a violation and stepping into a new sense of self. Imani watched in the mirror as the damaged ends fell away, each snip a small act of defiance, a quiet declaration of power. The stylist worked with a focused precision, shaping and molding not just hair, but a sense of renewal. Imani closed her eyes, inhaling the faint scent of hairspray and something else, something indefinable, something like hope. This isn't about vanity, she thought, the realization a slow bloom within her. This is about reclaiming my power. Back home, the silence of her room was a welcome refuge. She sat at her desk, the soft glow of her laptop screen illuminating her face. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, the image of her new haircut displayed on the screen, a stark contrast to the memory of the ragged ends left by Jordan's impulsive act. She stared at the photo, a sense of quiet determination settling within her. It was time. The words flowed then, not a torrent, but a steady stream, each one carefully chosen, each one imbued with the weight of her experience. "This is bigger than hair," she typed, the phrase a distillation of everything she had felt, everything she had endured. It was about respect, about dignity, about the insidious nature of casual cruelty and the silent complicity of those who stood by and watched. It was about the subtle ways in which girls were taught to minimize their own experiences, to brush off disrespect as just a joke. It was about the unspoken pressure to be agreeable, to be quiet, to not make a fuss. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the enter key. A fleeting wave of doubt washed over her. What if no one cares? The thought whispered, a tendril of insecurity trying to take root. She pushed it away. "It doesn't matter," she countered, her inner voice firm. "This is my story, my truth." She pressed enter. The response was almost immediate. A ripple, then a wave. Likes, comments, shares. Messages of support poured in, a chorus of voices echoing her own experience. Girls from her school, girls from other schools, girls she had never met. They shared their stories, stories of similar injustices, stories of casual cruelty and silent complicity, stories of being told to lighten up, to not be so sensitive, stories of feeling alone, of feeling unheard. Imani read each message, a sense of profound connection blooming within her. She wasn't alone. None of them were. Jordan Mercer's suspension was a footnote, a small victory in a much larger battle. The real victory was the wave of solidarity that was rising, a tide of voices refusing to be silenced. The image of her new haircut became a symbol, a rallying cry, a testament to the power of quiet defiance. It was a message not just to Jordan, but to the world. We will not be diminished. We will not be silenced. We will rise. The news of Jordan's suspension reached him as he sat in his room, the curtains drawn, the air thick with the stale scent of defeat. 3 days. Suspended for 3 days. He'd expected a slap on the wrist, a detention at most. He hadn't expected this. He'd underestimated Imani. He'd seen her quiet demeanor as weakness, as an invitation to exert his own perceived power. He'd miscalculated. He hadn't seen the steel beneath the surface, the quiet strength that now held him accountable. He scrolled through social media, his stomach twisting with each post, each comment, each share. Imani's photo stared back at him, her gaze steady, unwavering. The caption, "This is bigger than hair," mocked him with its simple truth. It wasn't just about the hair. It was about everything he represented. The casual cruelty, the entitlement, the blind acceptance of a social hierarchy that allowed him to believe he could act with impunity. He'd won a laugh, a moment of fleeting power. He'd gotten a revolution, a quiet, powerful revolution that was changing the landscape of their school, of their community. And he, Jordan Mercer, was at the epicenter of it all, not as the victor he'd imagined, but as a catalyst for change he hadn't foreseen. The weight of it settled upon him, heavy and suffocating. He'd wanted to be seen. Now he was, but not in the way he'd intended. The crisp autumn air, tinged with the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, bit at Imani's cheeks as she walked home. The weight of the day, the weight of all the eyes upon her, settled not as a burden, but a strange, unfamiliar warmth. Oaktai had become a crucible, a place where silence had ignited a fire. The hurried whispers, the averted gazes that had once felt like a suffocating blanket now held a different texture. They spoke of unease, of a shift in the unspoken rules that govern the hallways. She could almost taste the metallic tang of fear in the air. Not her own, but the fear of those who had stood by, silent witnesses. The fear of realizing they, too, were complicit. The assembly had been an experience. Principal Thorne, usually a figure of jovial authority, had stood stiffly at the podium, his words carefully chosen, his tone laced with a gravity that rarely graced his morning announcements. He spoke of respect and community, words that echoed hollowly in the vast auditorium, bouncing off the faces of students who just days before had chuckled at Jordan Mercer's cruel prank. Imani had watched them, her expression unreadable, her gaze sweeping across the sea of faces. She'd seen the flicker of recognition in some eyes, the defiance in others, and the unsettling blankness in many more. It was a landscape of the human condition, a microcosm of the world beyond the school walls. Each face, a reflection of choices made and not made, of voices raised and voices swallowed. Miss Vega, the assistant principal, had followed Thorne, her voice surprisingly firm. She'd spoken of the bystander effect, a term that resonated with Imani, a term that captured the insidious nature of silent complicity. It validated her own quiet defiance, transforming it from an act of individual resistance into a powerful commentary on the collective responsibility they all shared. But even in that validation, a hollow ache remained. The words, the apologies, they felt performative, a band-aid on a wound that ran far deeper than a few snipped strands of hair. They're just words, Imani, her mother, Tasha, had said earlier that morning, her voice a calming balm against the storm brewing within. Words without action are just whispers in the wind. Tasha's words, unlike those echoing in the assembly hall, held weight, anchored by a lifetime of facing down injustice with quiet strength. The memory of her mother's steady gaze, the unwavering support in her eyes, warmed Imani against the chill wind. Tasha hadn't offered platitudes or easy solutions. Instead, she'd listened, truly listened, to the turmoil beneath Imani's composed exterior. She understood that the incident with Jordan was merely the catalyst, a spark igniting a much larger fire. It was about more than hair. It was about the ingrained power dynamics, the casual cruelty that permeated the very air they breathed. It was about the weight of expectations, the pressure to conform, to shrink, to disappear. Imani kicked a loose stone down the sidewalk, watching it skip and tumble before coming to rest in the gutter. The small, seemingly insignificant act felt strangely liberating. A tiny rebellion against the inertia, against the expectation that she would simply absorb the injustice, swallow her anger, and move on. She wouldn't. "This isn't over," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the rustle of leaves under her feet. It wasn't a declaration of vengeance, but a promise. A promise to herself, to her mother, to every voice that had ever been silenced. The next day, the whispers continued, but they were different. They were laced with a new kind of tension, an undercurrent of uncertainty. The easy laughter that usually punctuated the hallways felt forced, brittle. Jordan Mercer, ostracized by his own social circle, moved through the school like a ghost, his bravado replaced by a haunted look that Imani found neither satisfying nor comforting. It was a hollow victory, a testament to the destructive power of silence finally broken. She knew that the real work was just beginning. The assembly, the apologies, the whispers, they were just the first ripples in a pond. The true test lay in what came next. Would the school, the community, truly confront the uncomfortable truths that had been laid bare? Or would they retreat back into the comfortable numbness of the status quo? The answer, Imani knew, lay not in the grand pronouncements of authority figures, but in the small, everyday choices of individuals. In the courage to speak up, to challenge, to refuse to be a bystander. In the quiet acts of defiance that, like pebbles tossed into a still pond, could create ripples that spread far beyond their initial point of impact. As she walked through the school doors, her head held high, Imani met the gazes that met hers. Some held curiosity, some apprehension, and some a flicker of something akin to understanding. It was a fragile hope, a seed planted in uncertain ground. But in that moment, Imani knew that staying silent was no longer an option. The silence had been broken, and the echoes would continue to reverberate, challenging them all to choose a side. The fight for respect, for dignity, for the simple right to exist without fear was a fight that demanded not just words, but action. And that, Imani realized, was a fight worth fighting.